My name is Chad Farrell. I'm the founder and chief executive officer of Encore Renewable Energy. Encore Renewable Energy is a full-service community-scale renewable energy project development company with a proven track record in advancing projects from concept to completion. As a values-led commercial solar company, we specialize in reclaiming undervalued real estate for clean energy generation and storage, helping us to revitalize communities and create a cleaner, brighter future for all. Brownfield redevelopment has always been in our DNA since our inception. And as our name suggests, our mission is to give these brownfield sites a second act or an encore as clean energy generation resources. So with all that said, we're excited to have you all here for what should be a fun and engaging hour together. We'll provide some high-level talking points around the impact of the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 on the transition of brownfields to Brightfields from a number of different perspectives, and then we'll look to open up the discussion for a Q&A session as we'd welcome any and all thoughts, comments, and questions from the audience. And while the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 is a truly transformative piece of legislation regarding our energy future here in the United States, with provisions intended to finally stand up a domestic clean energy manufacturing market, to provide increased funding for critical DOE loan programs, and finally legally defining greenhouse gases as pollutants. The discussion today will focus on the brownfield to Brightfield provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. So with that background, I'd like to introduce you all to our panel of experts for today's discussion. First, we have Adam Altenhofen. He's a senior vice president in the U.S. Bank's Environmental Finance Division, where he leads the group's impact investing efforts and product and service development focused on supporting the energy transition and environmental justice. While at U.S. Bank, Mr. Altenhofen has been responsible for either originating or closing investments that have financed over 7.4 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity. Prior to his current role, Adam held positions as a business development officer and a senior project manager for U.S. Bank's renewable energy investments groups. Mr. Altenhofen previously held positions in power and energy lending at U.S. Bank, and his background includes more than 18 years of experience in structured and corporate finance and for power projects, electric and water utilities, and independent power producers. Adam received his BS in Business Administration from Colorado State University. We also have Brian Bowden. Brian is a leader of the solid waste market group at Sanborn Head and Associates, and he brings extensive experience in solid waste, civil, and environmental, and geotechnical engineering to the team. Brian's focus is on the design, permitting, and construction of quality assurance for landfills, and he has led several initiatives to expand services to include brownfield solar redevelopment projects. Brian is a graduate of the University of Vermont, where he earned a bachelor's degree in civil and environmental engineering. He's the president of the board of directors of the American Council of Engineering Companies of Vermont and is active in other environmental and renewable energy organizations in Vermont. Finally, last but not least, Elizabeth Krause is a tax partner and co-lead of Power at K&L Gates, a law firm with a global presence across 5 continents. She provides business-focused solutions for U.S., federal, state, and international tax problems in a variety of transaction and investment structures. Elizabeth works hand in hand with clients to create and implement practical and efficient international and domestic corporate structures, negotiate tax-focused and tax-informed provisions in a variety of contracts, and leads transactions, particularly in the renewable energy and fuels, hydrogen, carbon, and cryptocurrency industries. In addition to supporting her clients, Elizabeth is the practice group coordinator of K&L Gates' global power practice. She's co-chair of their ESG practice, co-chair of their sustainability initiative, co-director of the Seattle chapter of Women of Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy, chair of the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance's Oregon Policy Subcommittee, and a member of the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association Board Advisory Committee. So I'd like to open up with a few brief remarks from our perspective as a solar developer working in the Brownfields to Brightfields space. And I'd like to sort of set the table with some information that I gleaned from the Rocky Mountain Institute, specifically Matthew Popkin's group, who are working to advocate for and advance the concept of Brownfields to Brightfields. It's a great resource, and so please check them out if you haven't already. They've also been developing a Brightfields Accelerator program with Kansas State University with an abundance of technical assistance, tools, and other resources to help local governments, site owners, and community partners make smart and sustainable choices about the reuse and revitalization of brownfield sites, and to prepare for funding, financing, and the procurement of clean energy associated with these projects. So again, setting the table, the Industrial Revolution fundamentally reshaped America's economy, but left behind a legacy of brownfields, land that is often contaminated and often neglected and underutilized. These kinds of sites are located all over the country and include closed landfills, shuttered coal plants and mines, abandoned gas stations and fuel processing facilities, and former factories and industrial plants. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency estimates that there are over 450,000 brownfield sites across the country. Additionally, Rocky Mountain Institute's report, The Future of Landfills is Bright, estimates that America's closed landfills alone could host at least 63 gigawatts of solar, enough to power more than 7.8 million American homes. So what are the benefits of redeveloping these brownfield sites with renewable energy? Well, there are many. The first, sustainably reusing already developed land to reduce the need to build on undeveloped land that could otherwise be used for housing, agriculture, and/or conservation. This speaks directly to the important issue of siting and the challenge of deploying projects at the scale we need to address climate change. Other benefits, reinvesting in sites that often lack other redevelopment options, especially when we're talking about closed-cap landfills and Superfund sites. These projects also help to address past environmental injustices by safely repurposing hazardous sites and bringing revenue to communities and neighborhoods within lower income and marginalized communities where these former industrial and commercial sites were often located. And finally, last but not least, these projects generally allow much easier access to the grid, as these sites are often located in areas with more robust electrical infrastructure. So from our perspective as developers, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 puts solar projects, brownfield solar projects that were previously not financeable or not competitively priced from a power purchase agreement standpoint, puts these projects on a level playing field with greenfield sites and should help to steer renewable energy development towards these previously developed but currently underutilized properties that the general public is strongly supportive of redeveloping for solar and increasingly energy storage. So that's enough from me. But before we dive into a discussion with a few questions for the panel, I'd like to open the floor for each panelist to provide a comment on what the Investment Reduction Act means with respect to brownfields to Brightfields development, and/or what you are all seeing in terms of recent activity in this space from your perspectives. And I think about this perhaps something along the lines of the Free Electron segment of the Energy Gang podcast. Basically a tidbit of information that you could leave the audience about the bill and about the state of brownfields to Brightfields from your perspectives. So why don't we go around the room here, and Elizabeth, do you wanna kick us off?
Sure, yeah, and thanks very much, Chad, for that intro. Really interesting information. I think the one thing that I'm hearing the most about in the context of brownfields is what is this actually going to be useful for, right? You mentioned solar. Solar makes a ton of sense. Obviously, that's where we get the term Brightfield, but these bonuses for energy communities, including brownfields, apply to a lot of the new credits. And so the question is what really can this be used for? Could we use it for landfill gas facilities? Probably not. Could we use it for other things? Yeah, probably so. It's just a matter of what and when and how.
Terrific. Adam?
Great. No, thanks, Chad. Appreciate it. Glad to be here. Yeah, I think from our perspective, maybe just an optimistic tone. I think we are, a group that is focused on, environmental justice and a just energy transition. So I think we're excited about the possibility of seeing more development in brownfield areas, converting, as you mentioned, past environmental injustices and to hopefully more environmental justice, or at least a just and equitable, energy transition, and bringing more of those communities into this transition and allowing them to benefit from it. So we're excited about the brownfield adder and some of the other, energy communities and environmental justice adders as well.
Terrific. Brian, what's making you excited and for the future ahead for the practice that you've created at Sanborn Head?
Sure. So fortunately, Sanborn Head has a lot of industrial clients, and many of them have underutilized properties that will certainly benefit from IRA. So I'm really giddy as an engineer and consultant to kind of use the skill sets that we have as a company and to help our clients achieve their goals and help them develop these liabilities that they have for properties into assets, and also help them achieve their sustainability goals, and which as a company we have as well. So it's an exciting opportunity on many fronts for us.
Terrific. That sounds great. Well, thanks for those initial comments from you all. And why don't we dive right in here? We've got a small handful of questions prepared for the panel, and then, as I said earlier, really looking forward to soliciting additional questions and comments from the audience today. So let's start with just the definitions. Like, what is an energy community as defined under the IRA? Elizabeth, do you wanna start with that? And I'm happy to round robin it however you all want to engage here.
Sure, definitely. I mean, energy communities are three different tranches of areas, okay? Obviously, brownfields is perhaps the easiest one to understand, right? Because we have specific definitions. The tax code refers to the EPA rules, specifically the brownfield rules under CERCLA, right? I think we all have a pretty good grasp on what that is, right? Just to be a little pedantic, it's a real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant, right? That's a lot of different places. That's old laundromats, potentially. Or it's old gas stations. It's maybe some landfills. So there's a lot of different places. There are a few exceptions that we don't really need to get into, right? If it's an active Superfund site, it's not technically a brownfield. So there are some questions you have to ask. But one thing that I want to point out here is that there are some really great resources online that are mapping tools that show you where these sites are. Note that those are sites that are registered with EPA, but the definition of brownfield is broader than that. It doesn't have to be registered. And so anytime you're diligencing a project, you should think about, well, is there a chance that this could be a brownfield? Should we look into it, even if it hasn't been registered? So that's sort of the easiest category to grapple with. But there are two other categories that are a little harder. One is metropolitan statistical areas. We know what that means from the census, and non-metropolitan statistical areas. We don't know what that means, okay? We need guidance. And then it talks about these specific areas that have historic ties based on tax revenues or unemployment to extraction, processing, transportation, storage of coal, oil, and natural gas, okay? So think about your historic communities where there was a coal mine or there's been natural gas extraction. Think about the Permian Basin. Think about, your friendly local coal generation plant that maybe got shut down a couple of years ago. Those are a lot of those places that are going to qualify. We don't know exactly where they are. Why? Because some of the data that we need, it depends on local authorities, and that data is not always available to the public without digging through files in some courthouse somewhere. And so we need Treasury to issue a list, really. That's probably the only way to really administer this particular category. I've personally submitted a few different comments to Treasury specifically asking for a list, right? If you have a site that you think qualifies, you should do some diligence and maybe ask for recognition too. Then there's a third category that talks about census tracts where either a coal mine's closed since 99 or a coal-fired electric generation unit has been closed since 2009. And so, or adjacent census tracts too. So again, trying to get the energy transition, trying to ensure that jobs and development are coming to those areas of the country that have been historically reliant on dirty energy, and trying to address some of those transition issues.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And you know, I've been referencing this policy or this legislation is really progressive policy, right? I mean, and I think a lot of the elements of trying to drive the energy transition through communities that have supported America's energy needs for decades, and really trying to realize that just transition is extremely important. And I would include the domestic, you know, I know we're talking about brownfields to brightfields, but you know, the domestic manufacturing provisions as well, which is all about creating millions and millions of jobs to support this transition. And these are jobs that can't be outsourced overseas. So really, really progressive and good policy. So, and you're also touching on another question I wanted to sort of bring up, which is, I think we all know that the Treasury is requesting comments and questions on the IRA. So this is more of a note to the general audience here. You know, we'd love to hear some of the questions that you are curious about, because quite frankly, we're probably all curious about them as well. If folks don't know, you know, Treasury is due to come out with some guidance around all the provisions of the IRA. We've been hearing, you know, at some point before the end of the year or right around the first of the year. So it'd be great to hear from folks, you know, what some of these questions that people have, I guess, with respect to this particular topic, along the lines of some of the provisions that do speak to energy communities and brownfields. Yeah. So,
well, so just one note on that. Comments are due tomorrow on energy communities. Is that a hard and fast deadline? No, not really. You can keep submitting comments if you want to. Treasury's going to leave it open. But there's, you know, as more time goes by, there's a greater chance that they won't read it before they issue regulations or other guidance. Yeah. Now, this particular guidance is probably a little farther down on their list as far as a priority, simply because there are a lot of other things that are way more impactful, like wage and apprenticeship, for example. Yep. We do have a batch of 6 requests that are due tomorrow. Most of them are electricity related. And a few other categories as well, energy efficiency, things like that. And they just released this morning 3 more notices requesting comments on hydrogen, transportation fuel, carbon capture, commercial vehicles. So
fantastic. Thank you for that information, Elizabeth. That's terrific. I guess we just sort of talked about, you know, what is an energy community, and you know, the first of the 3 buckets are, as you mentioned, brownfields as defined by CERCLA. I'd like to just, you and I have touched on this in the past, and I just want to make sure that we socialize it with the larger group here. What are you thinking about closed capped landfills? And you know, there are some waivers in that definition of brownfields as defined by the CERCLA legislation. So, you know, how do we confirm that closed capped landfills would also be considered or meet the definition of a brownfield? So I've heard, you know, interpretation of landfills being classified as brownfields includes a commercial use test. Can you elaborate a little bit further on some of the thinking there?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer your question, but maybe not as directly as you might like, Chad. The point here really is, I think the broader point, okay, is that these are tax provisions, okay? Treasury is not the EPA, but the tax code on this point refers directly to CERCLA, right? And so it's hard to say that Treasury has a lot of wiggle room, but somebody has to interpret those rules. And so I suspect what's going to end up happening is Treasury is going to largely punt to EPA. And they're going to say something along the lines of, if you can demonstrate for us that under CERCLA, this is a brownfield as interpreted by EPA, then okay. this is a brownfield. And do you otherwise qualify? Fabulous. Here's your bonus credit. I suspect that's what's going to happen. That's not going to be universal. Other parts of the code and these sections refer to other things, like you mentioned domestic content earlier. The code refers to the Buy American rules for government contracts. There's a little more room for interpretation there because of how the statute's drafted. But in this case, it's quite direct. So, I mean, I guess I would go back to you and say, look, do my environmental lawyers during diligence say that this qualifies? And if the answer is yes, then I'm going to be pretty happy. If, on the other hand, there's some detail in the analysis of your closed cap landfill, commercial use, et cetera, that means that it's not qualified as a brownfield under CERCLA, or we can't get comfortable that it is, then Adam's probably going to look at me cross-eyed and say, we can't finance that. And so I'm going to say no. So.
Gotcha. Terrific. Yeah, lots of questions that we're going to need to figure out answers to moving forward. So maybe if I could kick it over to Adam on a similar topic. We now have the baseline ITC, again, strong public policy. In order to get the 30%, the full 30% investment tax credit for the next 10 years, and or until we've reduced emissions 75% over 2005 levels. So we've been sort of saying, look, we've got this tax incentive for renewable energy essentially until we solve climate change. So that's an important element. But in order to get that full 30%, obviously there are labor, livable wage requirements and apprenticeship requirements. Again, really strong policy there. But in terms of securing the adders that go along with these energy community projects, and specifically the 10% adder that would get your investment tax credit up to 40%, how, Adam, are lenders and financial institutions looking at securing or underwriting those investment tax credit claims, or those stepped up investment tax credit claims? Can you provide any light there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gonna. I mean, I think to immediately punt, right? Like, I think we need guidance, right? We need strong, kind of clear guidance. I think to what Elizabeth was alluding to as well, if it's unclear and if Treasury is not going to issue guidance on, say, if a capped landfill qualifies for the brownfield adder, you're gonna get a mixed reaction, I think, from the tax equity community on whether or not they're going to fund and take that risk themselves. You can obviously backstop it with reps and warranties from the sponsor, but there will be certain investors that say, look, that's a meaningful swing, right? That's a 10% swing if we apply and say it's a 40% credit, and it comes out that no, in fact, this was actually part of the excluded definition in CERCLA, and your environmental lawyers just read it incorrectly. I think that could have the effect of it not being as impactful for certain types of projects. So hopefully we will get strong guidance. In the interim, before we have guidance, I think we are there's other aspects of it that I think are unclear as well, that we need strong guidance on as well, right? So if a remediated brownfield, if you've remediated a site that was environmentally contaminated, is that still a brownfield or not? I think that's a question that we need to understand. If you typically when we get a phase one, if it says you need to get an environmental phase two, and you get a phase two, and the solution might be, and Brian obviously would love to hear your thoughts on this too, but the solution would be let's design around that environmental contamination to mitigate the risk. Well, if I've been designed around the environmental contamination of my site now not in the brownfield? So I think that's another area where we need to understand the guidance on what constitutes the system being in the brownfield. How much of the system needs to be on the brownfield versus not. I think those are all kind of open questions that we need. And so before having those, it's going to be hard to get a tax equity investor to commit assuming a 40% credit, assuming you meet the wage and apprenticeship requirements. So, they may say, we're only going to fund on the 30% credit. If there's decent facts and circumstances, maybe they put in there, an approval to fund the additional 10 if good guidance comes out and this qualifies. So, that's a different concept too for banks as well, right? So banks are typically looking at it, they know what their tax capacity is, or even corporate investors, they know, like, I need a certain amount of credits, right? I need 100 million in credits. So now all of a sudden, if the deal becomes 110 million, and the other deals also have these adders that you weren't expecting, that can also now all of a sudden change, like, how much tax capacity you need. So there's this kind of period of time where I think there's going to be there's going to be a lot of negotiation within the deal on what happens if there's an increase in credits. Perhaps some of the other provisions of IRA, help with that, like transferability and things like that, where you could transfer some of those excess credits. But there's some, there's going to be there's this interim period where we need to kind of get some clear guidance so we can actually underwrite and assess whether or not these adders are applicable to the actual project.
Terrific. Thanks, Adam. And Brian, do you wanna pick up on that at all, just from the sort of regulatory perspective or the permitting perspective? Like, once a brownfield, always a brownfield, or can you sort of walk us through, I guess, sort of how the regulator, or from your perspective, how the regulators have historically looked at repurposing brownfields and closed cap landfills for clean energy, and how that might look moving forward, especially with respect to the concept of, if we clean it up, is it still a brownfield?
Yeah, so I would say, it's very state dependent, but in most situations, a brownfield site, and for some of the grants and funding mechanisms for the funding those projects, is correlated to cleaning up the site. So I would say in most cases, yes, if a site is cleaned up, it should be still considered a brownfield in most situations, and therefore should be developed, could be developed under this funding mechanism. Obviously, not knowing the rules, that's kind of my gut and the way things should be done based on my experience, but there's certainly provisions there. And that said, even if the brownfield contains contaminated soils, it doesn't mean it can't be developed without removing those soils. There's a lot of engineering practices that can be incorporated and design practices incorporated to these types of projects, where you're really, the goal here is to minimize the disturbance of the contaminated soil. So if you're doing that, you're incorporating engineering measures such as ballast foundations or mat foundation systems to support the infrastructure that dissipates the load over greater areas, so it's not impacting the contaminated soils and the migration of contamination in groundwater. Then those sites certainly could be developed for as part of this Brightfield brownfields type approach.
Yeah, I think you're sort of getting to the concept of like a risk-based cleanup, right? Like developing a solar project on a brownfield, and I think in most people's minds should be different than redeveloping the site for housing or other forms of development where humans will be much more prevalent on the site, right? Have you seen that there's sort of that regulators are advancing around risk-based cleanups?
Yeah, certainly. And with these types of projects, I think it's important, especially when you consider costs, is to really pick and choose where you're developing the sites. You could have a brownfield site that has a heavily concentrated contaminated area in one portion of it, and it's not as contaminated elsewhere, but the entire site's considered a brownfield. So depending on the size of the project, what you're trying to do, it's important to focus on those areas that would have less likely to compromise the site, so it's easier to permit and develop.
Terrific. Excellent. All right. Well, let's head back to sort of, I guess, the finance and how we're going to actually get these projects over the finish line. And my mind goes to insurance, right? The solar industry, and in particular the brownfield solar industry, has been backed by innovative insurance products for a number of years now. How, Adam and or Elizabeth, I guess, how do you see insurance playing a role here? And, what kinds of insurance products should we all be learning about and thinking about for our Brownfields to Brightfields toolboxes?
Adam, go ahead.
Trying to figure out how to get off mute here. Not as used to WebEx as I used to be. Yeah, I think, I think there's probably, on the kind of project level side, right? There's, pollution coverage that you could get to explicitly, mitigate some of the concerns around, releases, if you've actually, released contaminants or disturbed contaminants there. So there could be, excess policies or carve outs for pollution coverage. And we usually, assess that. We look for that type of coverage on, capped landfill projects as well. So I think that would, continue to be, something we would focus on with our insurance consultant as well. I think the importance of, making sure you've got, your phase 1 or 2 done in, within the kind of 180 days to ensure that the tax investor, has the, innocent landowner protections under CERCLA as well. Those are important as well. Not having those lapse, because that'll just, slow down and hold up closing. Those are important risk mitigation tools as well. Maybe on some of the broader risks as well that we touched on before around just kind of guidance and things like that. The tax credit recapture insurance market is also growing as well. So there could be opportunities for, if it is a questionable project, or if the tax investor just can't quite get there on certain aspects of whether or not it qualifies for an adder, the recapture insurance could be a solution for some investors where, okay, I'll insure over that risk, I'll rep and warranty to it, and then I'll get tax credit insurance to ensure that if the IRS came back and said, oh, you didn't actually qualify for that adder, the insurance would cover you for that adder. So maybe kind of, a few different buckets of risk mitigation available there.
Yeah, those are exciting policies that I've been learning about myself. Sort of the tax credit, backing up our claims on these tax credits and the eligibility thereof. So look forward to learning more about some of these innovative products. Elizabeth, anything to add there?
Just that, on tax credit insurance, I think that's a really important thing to think about here, right? It's becoming more and more popular in the market over the last handful of years. And the changes in the credits, from what I understand with talking with folks in the industry, are not going to dramatically change how the coverage works. It's just a matter of what it covers and how much of it covers. There are some mitigation tools too to try to keep costs down on the policies because of how some of these adders work, how the wage and apprenticeship rules work. So we're not talking about, a 10% increase in your policy cost either, or even a 33% increase in your policy cost. We're talking about a little bit more marginal increases usually, from what I understand anyway. The other thing though too is, I think with these changes, what we're grappling with right now as lawyers is how to account for them, how to account for the adders in diligence, and how to account for them in the documents, right? I'm going to have a call on Monday with opposing counsel to knit something together that works for everybody. It's going to be fun. But the point is that there is no market practice yet. So there's still some uncertainty, and there's still a need not only for investors to do that diligence, which reduces their risk, and do deep diligence on some of these things at the moment, but also for all the parties to sit down and figure out what the way forward is so that no one's wearing all of the risk and the risk is appropriately shifted among the parties. I think that's going to be an evolving thing over the next few months, and it's important.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Brian, let's go back to you. Just as practitioners, when we're looking for sites to host larger scale, commercial scale, or utility scale solar projects, we're always concerned with the interconnection capacity of the site, right? That's the first and foremost. What else should we be thinking about with respect to brownfields? What kind of technical considerations with regard to engineering and site prep should we be considering as we are looking at various brownfield sites as host sites for either solar or increasingly energy storage, right? And I guess what I'm getting at is, how do we mitigate some of the increased risks and therefore the increased costs associated with, and the increased the technical challenges you mentioned, ballasted blocks and so on and so forth. So it's great to have the 10% adder that helps offset some of those costs, but what kind of technical considerations should we be thinking about to really, as I said earlier, level the playing field with greenfield solar and energy storage development?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I think site selection and not just site selection, but where on site you're locating the system is a big part of keeping costs down and really reducing some of the design constraints that you need to consider. Most projects, you hope that a cap, corrective action plan, and an actual formal cap does not need to be installed on a project, but it might. So looking for areas on site where a full blown cap is not needed is certainly a way to reduce costs and risk. Really the type of soils that are contaminated, whether they're compressible soils, there's so many things to consider when you're thinking about loading an area. When I say loading, it's basically adding the weight of a system, whether it's a building or a solar system, to take into consideration to make sure that you're not having any impacts on the environment. You're not going to have any problems with settling of your system, whatever you're building down the road as well. So, cost implications are tough on brownfield projects and how to keep them in check. None of us, whether it's the investor, the developer, the consultant, none of us like to see cost overruns. So I think, the biggest thing, it's not really technical, but an approach that I think is really valuable is a few things to consider on that end is to really keep communication open. Most things that go awry in life is because of lack of communication. So I think it's very important for the developer to really express their business model and maybe their criteria for success of the engineering and permitting team, so they have an idea of really what the goal is, what the cost implications may be. So we're aware of it. We can help guide the developer on different avenues, whether it's design or siting, to keep costs down to the best we can based on the type of size project and the desire for the project. The other part that's really critical with this, and it ties with communication, is open communication with the regulators at the onset of a project. A lot of these project overruns usually take place because when you go through the design phase to the permitting phase, the regulators ask for more information or change their mind. So keeping open communication at the onset with the regulators is critical. Set up a meeting at the onset, kind of talk about what you're planning to do as a team with the regulator and keep them apprised of changes, anything that comes up with your findings. Really doing some due diligence at the beginning of a project to figure out what the contaminative concerns are at that site and having a good idea of what is known and really what further information is needed to develop the project is really going to be critical to the success of a project and keeping costs in check.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the the mention of the importance of communication. And I mean, these are largely these are complicated projects that require a lot of coordination among a lot of different stakeholders. Your points about the importance of communications, both within the project team as well as with the regulators and the community, the hosting community, super important. We can't stress that enough. I guess I'd like to start thinking about opening up the session to questions from the group. Before we do that, do any of the three of you have any additional items that you'd like to bring to the audience before we may have not touched on thus far? Maybe we'll get there in questions, but just curious if there's anything that you all think should be communicated to the audience before we get into Q&A.
Well, one thing that I've been wondering about from the financing perspective is when the larger syndicators like US Bank, Bank of America, et cetera, are going to be comfortable enough with some of these adders in order to move ahead on projects. I suspect the answer is when regulations are released, but Adam, any thoughts on that?
I think that's generally right, Elizabeth. Yep. I think when regulations, are released, when there's guidance out there, that's probably, I think, when we would be comfortable like including it in the upfront commitment. Absent that, I think then it's going to be back to kind of facts and circumstance based and saying, okay, this looks like it probably will qualify. Let's go ahead and, we'll close on a 30%, for instance. And especially that since that's safe harbor, we'll close on the 30% and, but we'll allow for kind of room in the commitment to be upsized if it does qualify. So I think, there's probably there's a transition period here before that, but I think absent that, it'll be hard to make investments in some of these unless it's just so clear as day that it qualifies. However, I think there's just a lot of questions with some of these that I'm not sure, what that unicorn of a project would look like, but perhaps, never say never, right? So, yep. So, yeah.
Fair enough. Well, and you mentioned too this concept of an increase in funding. I think we've seen that in sort of principle for a couple of years, right? Because people kept hoping we were going to get a change in tax credits, right? But now it's real. And one of my concerns and concerns of some of my clients is, well, look, if I have to go to my CFO for approval twice, that's not going to work. How do you think that's going to work out? Do you think people are going to agree to that on a broad scale and folks are just going to get used to it? Or do you think it's going to be a friction point on some of these potential adders? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, meaning if the developer has to kind of go back and get approval, again.
The investor has to go back.
The investor, yeah. So I was going to say the investor, I think is harder, right? And I think especially on the corporate investor side, I think that's a challenge, right? And where they may say, look, I'm going to get approval once, and I'm going to get approval for X, and maybe I'll give you, I think we generally have a 5% kind of upward adjuster in our deal to allow for kind of increased cost, and maybe they'll give you that, but hey, if you get two adders and all of a sudden it becomes a 50% credit, that's a different conversation, and I may not be able to go back to that. So I think there's going to be that challenge, I think, with corporate investors and with banks too. I mean, we just, we have certain, policy thresholds and limits, and, when you could cross between one approver to the next, if you have to go from 30 to 40 or 30 to 50. So I think that's a real consideration, and there will be a lot of, I think a lot of discussion on how we deal with that. As I mentioned before, maybe, in the really sticky scenarios, it's okay, like, we'll put in the ability to, transfer the credits out if nobody can, we can't get back to, if we can't get to the 50% level, right? We could maybe transfer some of those credits out. Of course, we need guidance and understanding of how you can transfer those credits too, but maybe that's an easier solution than, asking for, a 20% increase, significant increase in your commitment. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I also have a question for you also, Brian. And forgive me, because I'm not an environmental lawyer. I listen to my environmental lawyers, let me put it that way. When is it a bad idea to go out and build on brownfields? I mean, that's one thing that we worry about.
Any time that you're going to do more harm to the environment than is already there. In all of us, it's as an engineer and an environmentalist, we got to do what's best for people, for the greater good, and protecting the environment is a big part of that. So developing a site that has a likelihood of getting further contaminated is just not a good idea in any sense.
Okay.
will say, I'll add one thing that's not related to this, but something, just another statement that I think people should consider with these projects. You know, with the IRA funding that's coming, the ARPA funding that's out there, if a lot of these projects come to fruition like people are thinking, there's likely going to be a shortage of engineers. There's going to be a shortage of regulators, and there's going to be a shortage of contractors to get the work done. And who knows if this looming recession that people are talking about is going to happen, but my recommendation is definitely if you have a project that has deadlines and specific milestones, that you start the process early, because there's a good likelihood that there's just not going to be enough people to get the project done in the timeline you want.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that point, Brian. You know, a number of us were out in Anaheim at the National RE Plus conference a month or so back, and you know, while there was palpable excitement with the passage of this bill, the immediate sort of discussion sort of went to three different constraints and three different larger sort of concerns that we have to reach the deployment goals that both the Biden administration have put forth, and as well as a number of different states. And, you know, the first is the grid. How are we going to modernize this grid as soon as possible to be able to interconnect all these new generation resources? The second was, you know, quite frankly, NIMBYism. Like, how are we going to get access to to enough land that we need to achieve this build out? And while we talk about millions of acres, I think the Brownfields to Brightfields, this is exactly why this is a very important topic, because it reduces the pressure on that otherwise undevelopable land. But the third thing that came up time and time again is labor resources. Where are we going to get, you know, not only the developers and the regulators and the bankers and the lawyers and the accountants, but where are we going to get all the folks to manufacture all the equipment that we need domestically? Because we haven't touched on it here, but there's some important domestic manufacturing incentives in this bill. And where are we going to get all the folks to actually be out in the field building these facilities? And so in my mind, it speaks to the importance of vocational training. It speaks to the importance of, you know, getting back to being sort of, you know, an economy that rewards, you know, work with our hands, whether that be manufacturing things, whether that be installing things. I think there's a really rewarding future for folks that enter into those trades. And, you know, there's millions and millions of jobs to be had. We just need to find the folks and encourage younger folks and older folks making a transition to join this workforce, because good paying jobs, tons of them. So thanks for bringing that up. We've only got about 10 minutes left, folks. We got a few more questions here, but curious if there's any thoughts and comments from the audience. And if you have any, please drop them into the chat, and we'll be sure to address them. I guess in the meantime, Brian, let's go back to you and sort of think about ways that we can sort of further control risk around these projects. And maybe this is a question for Elizabeth as well from the legal perspective, but you know, we all know that renewable energy project development requires an accurate understanding of any and all costs associated with a project, and we need to control those costs, right? I mean, you know, it's development, so things are going to change, timelines are going to extend, you know, initial budgets are going to get tweaked throughout the process of developing the project. But we want to, you know, understand that we've got a reasonable amount of cost control. You know, we want to know that $100,000 or $200,000 of site stabilization or remediation costs don't become $300,000 or $400,000, and that could, you know, significantly curtail the project. So how, you know, how is the environmental engineering sector looking to serve or reduce or eliminate the risk of these cost overruns for site stabilization, and remediation, and ultimately regulatory approval, or, you know, what we call site closure? Any thoughts there on again, some different tools that could be in the toolbox?
I guess I'll start there, and a lot of it might sound a little redundant, but to my other comments. But you I think communication and having a good understanding of the site before you get in, you kind of commit to it is key to having a better understanding of what your liabilities are, what the risks are. There's programs that states have actually that will help reduce your liability long term as well. Vermont has the Umbrella program. You get a approved brownfield site that's approved for development that mitigates some of your long term risks by basically if rules change with EPA and thresholds for different contaminants change, you're not liable to address those and meet those goals. And you're kind of basically keyed into whatever it was when you permitted the site. So there's certainly mechanisms like that long term that can reduce risk and costs on projects. A lot of it I think comes down to just making sure that you have an adequate site at the onset, and sites that have more contamination, more different types of contamination means for contaminant migration are the sites probably where you should stay away from, because those are the ones that are going to have increased mitigation costs to make your project viable from a regulatory standpoint.
Awesome. I guess that's where insurance comes in as well, right? I mean, that there are insurance products out there that sort of cover sort of overruns, and I think that's going to be an important aspect of ultimately financing these projects, because as we say all the time, if these projects don't pencil, they don't get built. So it's really critical that we're able to control those costs to the greatest degree possible. Again, understanding that development is, we're in the business of controlling risk and mitigating risk from what we call concept all the way to commissioning. But any and all tools that we can have in the toolbox that speak to that risk control are extremely helpful. So yeah, so I guess yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth. Sorry.
Well, one thing on that is I think there's a really big question about how the risk will be shared contractually too. Obviously, we want to try to control the costs ever appearing or ever being realized, right? And that's where Brian and you come in, really. But on the other hand, things do happen, right? And we have to address that in the investment documents. And so there's a really big question right now with these adders, particularly with the domestic content and the energy communities adders, about how to spread those costs, right? Because if you're going to get 10% more in tax credits for the investor, yes, they're paying for that, but how much are they paying for that? How much risk are they bearing relative to the amount that they're paying? And I don't think there's not an answer yet, although, obviously the gut answer is the tax equity investor is not going to bear that risk, right? They're going to have to bear something. They're going to have to bear something, but they're not going to do it willingly. Let me put it that way. Right. And so developers out there, I think, are in sort of a tight spot, right? Because they need to be able to predict that those costs increase and bake it into the prices, because trying to change it later is just not going to happen. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up as well, Elizabeth. We are often in a tight spot as developers, trying to put forth a PPA price to a customer for a project that will be delivered in 2 years. And, you look what's happened just recently in the last few months with interest rates, with, historic inflation, with constraints on supply chain and transportation, lack of transportation professionals. So yeah, it's again, it's all about managing that risk. But if we don't have accurate, budgetary assumptions going in, it's extremely difficult. And the last thing we ever want to be doing is having to renegotiate power purchase agreements with customers. That gives us and the greater industry just a bit of a black eye. And so
right. Well, and so Treasury can do something about that, right? One option that they do have in writing guidance is they could say, look, it's brownfields as of the date of enactment, right? And so they can do something to prevent the realization of future risk, but they're not going to be able to solve it. Some of it's going to have to come down to other agencies, states, as well as just contractual counterparties to sort it out. But that is one thing that state and local governments can do too, is to pay attention to these tax credits and how they work and attempt to work with the program rather than against it.
Yep, terrific. Absolutely. Adam, any final thoughts from your perspective on this topic before we look to wrap?
I was just going to echo kind of what Brian said too on just kind of communication. I think, budget's one thing for lenders and investors, obviously that's very important, but also timelines. So, and being realistic about when you approach kind of the financing community about where the project is at in terms of, development, permitting, and what else needs to be done. And, tax years, particularly for tax investors, are very important. So just over communicate, and try to set as realistic timelines as you can, and recognizing there's a lot, as you mentioned, going on at the moment with supply chains and everything else that are affecting timelines. But just communicate. That's the best answer. Yeah.
That's amazing. I will give you the last word there, Adam. I think communication is the name of the game here as we all sort of chart our course through this exciting near future of repurposing brownfields for clean energy generation. So seeing that it's 2:59 at this point, at least here on the East Coast, I think we'll call it a wrap. And I'd really like to thank the panelists, Adam, Elizabeth, and Brian, for their time today, and thank you all for joining as well.